I'm Scott Klenowski, and my topic is Judas of the Lost Cause, James Longstreet, the Lost Cause myth, and the erasing of a Southern historical figure. Last time I tried saying that in one breath. As many of you know, and as most of the faculty know, I absolutely love the Civil War. I've come to a point in my life now where I'm going to study, well, this is part of it, I want to be a Civil War historian, and as I started getting into the topic, I had a great-grandfather who fought in the war, so it's kind of, the war's a little bit personal for me. It's a family connection, but as I got studying into this, I started coming across Confederate leadership, and as we know, the turning point in our American history, 40 years of war between the North and the South. But there's still a lot of it we're still discovering, people and other things, and we have, plenty of memorials out there to Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Tennessee is littered with Nathan Bedford Forrest, but there was one person who just was completely erased by all this. And that person, as I discovered, due to the lost cause mythology that came after the war, was, and that's a crappy picture, is James Longstreet. Now, he went to West Point, he fought in the Mexican-American War, as many of our officers did, and he was present at first Bull Run, second Bull Run, Antietam, which should be the next one coming up. Antietam, Gettysburg, any major battle in the Eastern Theater, he was there. And I started looking into this, and I found out he was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man. He was in charge of the First Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, and brilliant on the field. He could read a battlefield. He knew where to move people, where not to move people. And then you get to after the war, he was there at Appomattox when the surrender happened. The only major battle he did not engage in was Chancellorsville. He was off getting supplies during that part for the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, Gettysburg, I'll get to in a bit. He was very instrumental in a lot of their victories. But you get to after the war, and he decides, okay, well, war's over. And as most generals, he got involved in politics. Well, unfortunately for his decision, he decided to go with the Republican Party in the South, which a lot of Southerners viewed as being kind of traitors to him, since most Southerners were Democrats. And I wish I would put the letter in, but he wrote a letter where he kind of stressed, hey, we should work with them to kind of make a peaceful transition. But he also was known as saying in this letter, if we work with the Republicans, we can also control the vote of the freedmen who just recently got the franchise to vote. So he still wanted to maintain his white supremacist ideas as everyone else did, but he thought if we work within this party, we can still control everything. Most Southerners didn't see that. Now we get to 1871, Robert E. Lee dies, and we get to this man right here, Jubal Early. He was farther down in the chain of command in the Army of Northern Virginia. He comes back from exiling himself in Canada and Mexico. He becomes part of the Southern Historical Society, and he uses the platform to launch a campaign against James Longstreet, basically saying, this man, Robert E. Lee, had an idea for a dawn attack, while James Longstreet didn't follow through, and that's how we lost the war and our independence. And Jubal Early and his men started this in 1872 is when they started. And this is kind of carried on through up until it started changing roughly in the 1990s. You had some people early in the history. Longstreet's second wife, Helen, she wrote a book. Early 1900s, that really challenged Jubal Early's claims at the war. And then 1950s, more books started coming out. 1990, with the movie Gettysburg. Maybe you've seen it, it's a good movie. Tom Berenger plays Longstreet in the movie, and they start kind of erasing all this incompetent, sullen mystique that has been attached to him. In the movie, you see Longstreet is a very capable Corps commander. I mean, he does disagree with his commanding officer, but it happens. Jeffrey Ward wrote a biography in the late 90s that challenged these myths. Piston did it too. And we're seeing, even now, down in Gainesville, Georgia, there's a Longstreet Society where they're dedicated to helping fight these misconceptions about the general. And as we know, as I said before, there's plenty of statues out there for everyone else. Right now, there are only 2 statues to James Longstreet in the country. One's they should be coming up here shortly. One's in Gettysburg, which isn't too far away from where he was on the field on day 2. And the other one is in Gainesville, Georgia, where his former house stood. It's right there. The only things left of the house are the stairs going up and like a little grape orchard he grew out there. Yeah, I saw this. Well, when I was down there, the grapes weren't in bloom, so I was looking at twigs on the rafters. But that's right now. I did hear that there might be a third one, but no one knows if this has been sculpted or if it is sculpted, where it's even located in Gainesville. But yeah, I found it interesting. I've spent the past year reading everything I could about James Longstreet. I probably now own every book that they've written about the man, just to try to understand him and see where he, what his mindset was, what he was like. It's been an interesting trip. I would do this again more deeply into his life at a later date. I think I need a break from the general for a while. This is a statue at Gettysburg. Actually, this was supposed to be on a pedestal, but the National Park Service kind of said no more pedestals. So you can walk right up and look at the statue. One of the tools used to sculpt the statue is on display at the Longstreet Society in Gainesville. The sculptor, took the picture and said, "This is the little wood sculpting tool I used for this." And although I'm not too particularly, this is the one outside of where his home stood. I wish I would have put a picture on the back, but the United Daughters of the Confederacy local chapter named after James Longstreet did erect a statue, so one statue in their long history that's not lost cause related. Any questions? Dr. Gowan.
Can you tell us the 3 major tenets of the
major ones?
Lost cause myth?
The 3 major ones were the war was fought for states' rights, not slavery. The second tenet is the South was more chivalrous than the North. And 3, General Longstreet's the reason why they lost Gettysburg and their bid for independence.
So you've talked a lot about Longstreet today during this presentation, but your thesis is that all 3 of these tenets are incorrect. Is that right?
They are very incorrect. Looking at the primary sources, one of the major documents you can look at to get the idea that the war was over slavery is the article, or the Declarations of Secession that the Confederate States wrote. I think there's only like a small handful that don't mention slavery directly. South Carolina does. I forget which state it is, but they say right in the opening sentence, we identify with the institution of slavery, and that is pretty much what they fought for. Now, the chivalry, they believed that they were an agrarian society. As the North was becoming more industrialized, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they still stayed agrarian. And pretty much the only way I can compare this is fiefdoms in medieval England. Each king had his little territory, and this is what a lot of these plantation owners were. Judge, jury, and executioner for their own individual lands. And the plantations were spread out over miles, so who's going to challenge them? Especially if they were also lawmakers in the state. And for Longstreet at Gettysburg, it started in 1872 with Jubal Early saying that there was a dawn attack order. Well, if you look through the official records of the rebellion, there is nothing that says there was a dawn attack order even given for that day. Because in the early mornings of day 2 on Gettysburg, there was such a thick fog over the ground, they couldn't make an accurate reconnaissance until the fog lifted. And I give credit to the National Park Service on this. Every time I've been to Gettysburg, they've pointed out stuff to me. My last visit in March, they showed me on their fold-out map the trail that Longstreet took to get in position on day 2. Because the Union had, there's 2 little mountains at the south end of the field. They're called Little Round Top and Big Round Top. If you've seen Gettysburg, the famous 20th Maine defense of Little Round Top.
By a college professor who was leading that group, by the way, right?
A college?
Right.
No, it was a Park Service ranger who led that tour.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, the Union Army on Little
Yes,
Round Top
Joshua
was-
Chamberlain. He was a professor of Bowdoin College up in Maine.
Just couldn't let that go.
No, the whole purpose I took my son was so he could see where Joshua Chamberlain stood.
Yeah.
I think he has an idol, so I'm trying to nurture it a little bit. But there was a lookout up on Big Round Top, and Longstreet said, well, they're going to see us. They're going to see us coming. So they had a guide, and the guide got them lost on the way to position. So the attack was supposed to be 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They didn't get in position until 4 o'clock. Union's already reinforced the position, and he still had to lead the attack. So they kind of said, well, he disobeyed orders. It was supposed to be dawn, and because he didn't get his way, because Longstreet was trying to do a flank attack, Lee wanted a straight ahead attack. So he became sullen and unruly, and that kind of stuck with him up until the 1990s. This whole sullen and pouting. And the first time I ever came across the Lost Cause was in a book by Edward Bonkemper called The Myths of the Lost Cause. I never knew there was an area study on this. We grew up here in the North. We don't, we're taught very little in school about all this. And I found the book, and it was the first book that kind of led me on this rabbit hole of the Lost Cause. I'm thankful for that book. And there was an entire chapter on the book that talked about Longstreet and Gettysburg, and we're working now within the Civil War community to kind of combat these myths and say, hey, this is inaccurate, here's the primary sources, and it's a tough fight, but we're making headway.
I actually wanted students to ask questions first, but because you're on this topic, right, I have a question related to that. You talk about how in the 1990s, and you use the example of the movie Gettysburg, and then refer to some scholarly literature that starts to critique this lost cause myth, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? What was going on in the 1990s that made historians and other people, filmmakers, question?
See, right before that, the Ken Burns documentary had came out, The Civil War. and it got the public interested in the war again. And then we start seeing a new group of scholars start coming in that wants to challenge, it started challenging what they were taught growing up. And I found out when I was in Gainesville, Jeffrey Ward was a school teacher. And there's still Richard Pilcher at the Longstreet Society, who I talked to, which I thank for taking your oral history course, because I had some questions that day, and I was very calm about them when I approached him. You know, he said, well, Jeffrey Ward still used a little lost cause stuff when he wrote about Longstreet. The next one that came out after him was William Garrett Piston's Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant. He really went more into explaining where Longstreet fits in Southern history. And he went more into looking at not just the lost cause writers, but authors, poets. And he even looked at some plays that might have had a character that was molded after Longstreet in their play. And, you know, the sullen general who goes against Lee. And I think it just, scholarship got to a point where we wanted to challenge the old conceptions and just start reevaluating everything and trying to get to the root of the, you know, he told us in oral history, you know, you go broad and narrow it down. Well, I think that's what they did. They just started narrowing it down. Going, you know, well, where did this start? Okay, look here. Then they followed the trail.
And is it Southern historians too, not just historians of the South, but Southern historians of the South? Are they part of this critique, or is it mainly people from outside of the South?
Mainly was who started the critique, or
yeah, who are
Southern.
Part of sort of this new.
Actually, Piston taught over here in University of Missouri, and yeah, Piston was in Missouri. Garrett was, or Jeffrey Ward was a Pennsylvania school teacher. So we're seeing it more now coming from the North, which at times when I brought it up, I get the label of, you know, liberal revisionist, but as we learned, all history is revisionist in a way. Matt.
Scott, can you tell me more about Longstreet after the Civil War? I think that was where I was confused a little, because you said he was in a real good relationship, right, with Robert E. Lee.
He was. He maintained contact with Lee up until his death. Robert E. Lee died in 1870. At that time, he was president of, well, now it's called Washington Lee University. He ended up going down to New Orleans. He became like an broker in a cotton firm. Because of Republican connections, he got a job as customs inspector at the New Orleans port, president of a railroad company. This was all before the letter broke, and when the letter came out, you know, businesses kind of suffered, so his Republican friends, patronage jobs, started getting him. And it was more Grant at this point, because Grant was president. He was friends with Grant. Grant was in the class behind him at West Point, and Grant also married one of Longstreet's cousins. So family kinship there.
Did Southerners feel he betrayed the cause?
He did. Oh yeah.
You mean they did?
Yes, they did. Sorry. I've had enough of Dr. Gollin's saying he, they. I've told my girlfriend that after Dr. Gollin has looked at my papers, it's a murder scene. It's all done in red, and there's marks and notes on it.
This is it?
Can we frame that when you retire?
Scott, did Longstreet ever respond to critics?
At first he did.
Like saying he defeated the cause?
He did respond, but then his friends kind of said, well, you know, if you're not responding, it's kind of like the claims are true. So when he did, and politics wasn't his strong suit. He's a general. He came up through the army. He knows a battlefield. Politics is a different kind of battlefield. And he wasn't prepared for that, especially against the Virginians, which Jubal Early was, and Jubal Early got a lot of Lee's former staff officers on board with him at the Southern Historical Society. And Longstreet was born in South Carolina, raised in Georgia, and took his West Point appointment from Alabama. Southerners are very tied into, well, my family, we've lived here for 14 generations. Well, Longstreet felt he fought for the entire Confederacy instead of just a state. And he honestly, should have had no business getting involved in the political field. He didn't know that battlefield. He could be friends with someone, but yet he's going to write something about you, make you look bad. And I have to say, for an old soldier, he tried.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. So correct me if I'm wrong. You're not arguing that General Longstreet was someone we should admire in terms of his opinions about slavery and white supremacy. You're not arguing that there should be more statues of him, but that the ratio of statues of him compared to the other leaders of the Confederacy is askew because they blamed him for their defeat.
Yes. And it's not so much his views that suffered the attack, it was his military record. Mm-hmm. And as any soldier will tell you, your military record is everything.
But by sort of coming to his defense on that limited aspect of his biography, you're not defending Longstreet's decisions, you're not defending him, the man, you are further debunking the lost cause. You're debunking the third item of the lost cause myth that hasn't been fully debunked yet, while the other two have had a lot of debunking done.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's tough when you start looking at the military record, because you look at the command structure and the people who are making the attacks are farther down on the chain of command. Jubal Early, for one, he left the country because he burned Chambersburg, Pennsylvania during the war. Yeah. This Lincoln said, he wanted no hangings for because civil wars, you hang those who went against you. Well, Lincoln didn't want that. He wanted a peaceful transition, and I think had he lived, and I also think if Robert E. Lee had lived, I don't think we would have been dealing with the problems. It seems like Robert E. Lee was the glue that kind of held all these guys together. Like as a kid, mom and dad kind of keep a lid on things. Mom and dad leave for the night, what happens? You got a torn up house and a party going on in the backyard. That's kind of what happened with Lee's death. Yes.
So, in your assessment, Jubal Early and the other purveyors of the lost cause myth, were they true believers in that mythology, or was this a calculated and cynical effort to
I would say it was
regain
both.
power that they'd lost?
I would say it's both because I think the amnesty plans were, and they truly believed what they were saying because they come home to a devastated South, and you needed a hero to look up to. So who better to put on that pedestal was Robert E. Lee? Well, his military record was good except for Gettysburg. Well, we can't have this blemish on the record. So we need someone to blame for this blemish. And Longstreet just happened to be the well-known Confederate officer who became a Republican. So they're like, okay, we'll just blame it on him. So they did believe what they were writing, but then it was also calculated in picking who was going to be their scapegoat.
So I know then, this is to follow up on that question, I know that your work mainly addresses that third piece,
Yes.
right, the third tenet of the lost cause myth. But if, in arguing that they actually believed, Jubal Early and the others, actually believed in the myth, then how can you support that argument in terms of looking at, say, the first part of the myth, that it was not about, that the Civil War was not about slavery? Would you extend your argument to say that they truly believed too that it was not about slavery, that it was about states' rights, despite all the primary sources that you talked about that?
I would say so.
Clear.
I mean, I still see it today that the argument was, the fight was states' rights. And
Okay. So what then what difference does it make in terms of our understanding of the Civil War and the consequences of the Civil War in whether one believes the lost cause myth or not? If one believes it, how does that shape our understanding of Reconstruction and the legacies of Reconstruction, versus if one doesn't believe it, how does that shape our understanding of Reconstruction and the legacies of Reconstruction? And again, this is, I'm not trying to put you on the hot seat,
Right.
but you know
It's
more
a tough
about this
one.
than us, right? So, and if you can't, just answer the best you can, right? Or say what you would need to look at, or what would you need to know to be able to address that question?
what understanding with Reconstruction, they start coming in on the Reconstruction ended 1877, so they right about the halfway point they start coming up with this. And
Right, so do you think that there's a connection between when the lost cause myth
I think there
emerges
is because
and Reconstruction?
I think there is because everything that I've read, there was a very concentrated effort to fight Reconstruction, especially when you start putting in Republican-controlled governments, some of our first biracial governments were done during Reconstruction. Some of our first African-American senators and congressmen, sheriffs, elected officials. And this was such a threat to the white South that they fought it. They fought it from pretty much they started fighting it 1867, 1868, when we start seeing the Klan come about. But once Hayes took office in 77 and these Redeemer governments started coming in, it allowed them to dictate their narrative. And it gets, I know Eric Foner just wrote what's considered the Bible for Reconstruction, which we did the short version in your Civil War class. And it's interesting to see how they controlled everything once the Redeemer governments came in, which those governments also gave way later on to the Dunning School. I want to say his name was Charles Dunning. Okay, I'm going to start learning about that soon, but Dunning was he was a historian that came out 1900s, roughly.
Yeah.
So he started writing about Reconstruction being a failure, which that dominated the narrative of Reconstruction up until probably Foner's book in the 80s.
Well, only because people ignore W.E.B. Du Bois
Yeah,
in the 40s.
Du Bois. I have him on my list too.
So what did you
John O.
see
Franklin
then
in the
as the relationship between the lost cause myth and the Redeemer governments and the people who resisted Reconstruction and then took over at the end of Reconstruction?
The connection I saw is it was a romanticized version, kind of. I know I should have put this in the paper, but I looked at it as a kind of,
You still can.
yeah. So I wanted to talk to you after this was done. I looked at it more as like, they couldn't handle their defeat because it was against their honor. And they created this as kind of a way to deal with their PTSD from the war. So we romanticize the early days when everything was beautiful and we had we had no Yankee government down here telling us what to do. And it was a way for them to feel better after the war. I don't think they understood how far that belief system would have gone. I think they just dealt it with them, but then you get to United Daughters of the Confederacy and they start putting these into the school books. So then now you're raising a whole generation of children on this. And
Well, do you think that people jubal early in the as Professor Fackler said, that purveyors of the myth, do you think that they would have a problem with what the
No.
United Daughters of the Confederacy raised?
no, I don't think they did, because even if you look on their websites today, they still say,
Right.
they're still toting it.
Yeah.
I wish I would have had a chance to talk. When I was in Gainesville, and I was talking to Richard Pilcher at the Longstreet Society, he didn't have kind words to say about the UDC chapter down there. Because he's like, yeah, those ladies, they think they know everything about history. They don't know squat. I wish I would have had more time to talk with Richard than what I did. Because he was a fountain of information down there.
I have just like a general comment, I guess, for both presentations. I appreciated how relevant they are in today's historical context. These conversations about the controversy of Confederate statues and
Yes.
memorials. So you're in this kind of tricky position here where I'm glad that Dr. Gahn kind of helped clarify that you're not arguing we should have more memorials.
My views on those are, I think the monument should be put somewhere, museum,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of other historians said we should put another plaque next to it, explain the context
Mm-hmm.
that these were put up in.
Right, kind of try to set the record straight a little
Yeah.
bit about, again, kind of an accuracy issue. So that's always great in a thesis, that there's a connection to what's happening today and some of the conversations that are happening today.
Mhm.
And again, like what's happening in the UK and also in America in terms of xenophobia and
Mhm.
anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, and the conflation between the two a lot of times. So I appreciated that about both of your presentations.
Like I said, Civil War is a family connection for me, but we also live in the world that the war created.
Mhm.
And especially with the problems from Reconstruction, we're still dealing with them.
And I do just want to make another comment too about that. One of the strengths, I think, of your thesis is that Scott has a lot of very rich description, right, in his work that gives us a good sense of the time period and how people were looking at it, and raises the important issue of the importance of myth, right, in structuring history, right, and the reasons why certain myths emerge when they do, and what kind of function do they serve, in terms of how we understand the nation, right, and others, how we understand ourselves, right, so.
I found it amazing when I was in Gainesville. I saw a subdivision named after Longstreet, a cancer clinic, a pediatric center. So Gainesville is about the only town that I know of that has really embraced him. He lived there after he retired from politics. He owned a hotel called the Piedmont. Now one section still remains, is where the Longstreet Society is now. And from the pictures I've seen, this was a 3-story building contained on one city block, right near the railroad tracks. So you come in and you can go to a hotel. And on their sign, it is believed that Southern Fried Chicken first originated right there at the Piedmont. So I thought that was amazing when I looked at it. I'm like, really?
Yet another myth.
No, it wasn't started by Colonel
A
Sanders.
monument to
either.
the myth.
But that's the beauty of historical research, right? You come across these really neat things.
Right, and another thing about the Piedmont was Woodrow Wilson's daughter was born there.
Huh.
in the section that they found, they had built a housing development or apartment complex over what remained, and the Longstreet Society bought it and found out that, I don't know the daughter's name, but the room that she was born in was in that section, so it's called the Wilson Room. I looked at it, by the window there was a mannequin of General Longstreet, and above the fireplace, because every room had a fireplace in the hotel, there's a big portrait of Woodrow Wilson. I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting.
On a whole number of levels.
You're right.
Gotta bother you one more time, and I'm gonna ask you.
Not a problem, Matt.
Okay, in your opinion, you've done all the research on Longstreet. I guess what I'm looking for is, would he be your typical Southern gentleman? Did he believe staunchly in the cause of the Confederacy? So if he was alive today, minus the tenet of the lost cause that equates to him and his loss at Gettysburg, would he have believed that, or would he have championed that it was over states' rights and all
Yes.
that? Like Longstreet himself as a actor in history.
Yeah, because he learned it from his uncle Augustus. When he wanted to be a soldier since he was a little child, and his father knew that the only place you can get that type of education was West Point. So his father had a plantation somewhere near Gainesville. I don't know where. That's a follow-up question when I go down and talk to Richard again. But when he was living up there, his father sent him down to Augusta, Georgia to live with his uncle Augustus. And he was a newspaper publisher, a printer, a plantation owner, a judge, a satirist. But he was coming up around the time of the nullification crisis. So 1831, 1832, South Carolina is arguing with President Jackson. And he learns I guess they call it the School of States' Rights from his uncle. I mean, you're going to learn it from your family. He learned it straight from his uncle, and he did believe in it.
Although I would like to point out that this family that he was learning it from, his father and his uncle, were both plantation owners, right?
Yeah.
And that there's a way of falsely separating states' rights or slavery. Some people argue that states' rights is just a code word for slavery, right? So that if you're artificially separating those two things, no, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Well, why was it so important for them, for the states to have more power over some things than the federal government? In order to, it's not just an abstract ideal.
No, it wasn't.
One right in particular,
Right.
the right to allow.
It's
their
not just the
citizens to own
idealization
slaves.
of this principle of state rights, it's because this principle of states' rights supports a plantation system.
Right, I link it all back to the 3/5 compromise. If you have more territory, you have more slaves. More slaves means more representation in the House of Representatives, and that's what gave the South its power from 1789 when the Constitution was ratified up until 1861 South Carolina seceded.
And by that argument, it brings it back, it's about slavery, it's
Yeah.
not about political rights.
They were hoping for, right now I'm reading Madness Rules the Hour, Charleston, during 1860. Nothing I've read in that book so far has ever said anything that they left over tariffs or whatever else they said. Every single argument was slavery. And even before the election, Charleston was making plans to secede already. Secession for them was the fail-safe, the backup plan in case Lincoln won. Lincoln wins, we're out of here. And then they sent out secession commissioners to the other states. I've read some of their speeches, and everything they were saying was slavery. And they were hoping a Democrat would have gotten office, opened up the territories, which, if that would have been the case, the northern states who were in the Union at the time, we may have been the only ones non-slave unless they passed a law that said they would have forced it on us.
In fact, the Dred Scott decision was.
That was
a
that was
would have
the
forced
deciding
slavery on
factor in the
them.
Democratic Party at that point. If you accepted the Dred Scott, all right, fine. Stephen Douglas didn't, and that's why, you know, the Democrats had 4 different candidates on the ticket in 1860.
The two.